My sister stole my inheritance thinking I'd never find out. But when I did, everything changed. What started as a quiet discovery turned into a battle that would tear our family apart and force me to confront the truth about trust, betrayal, and the lengths people will go to for money. This is the story of how I fought back, reclaimed what was mine, and learned that sometimes the hardest battles lead to the most unexpected beginning. When my parents passed away, they left behind a will that divided everything equally between me and my sister Clara. Or at least, that's what I thought. The lawyer had read it out loud at the family meeting, and Clara had nodded along, her face calm and supportive. She even hugged me afterward, saying, "We'll get through this together." But now, sitting in my small apartment with a stack of papers in front of me, I realized that hug had been a lie. Clara had stolen my inheritance, and she thought I'd never find out. It all started when I received an email from the family lawyer. He said there were some discrepancies in the estate's final distribution and asked me to come in for a meeting. I didn't think much of it at first, maybe a missing document or a clerical error. But when I sat down in his office, he slid a folder across the table. "Your sister's name is on accounts and properties that were supposed to be split between you," he said. My heart dropped. Clara had been managing the estate after our parents' death, and I'd trusted her completely. Now I felt like a fool. I started digging into the records, and the more I looked, the worse it got. Clara had transferred money from our parents' accounts into her own name. She'd even put one of the family properties under her name alone. I called her, my hands shaking, and asked her about it. She sounded calm, almost too calm. "There must be a mistake," she said. "I'll look into it." But days passed and she didn't get back to me. Instead, I found more evidence: forged signatures, hidden bank statements, and emails where she'd instructed the lawyer to make changes to the will. She'd planned this for months, maybe even years. I didn't want to believe it. Clara was my sister, the person I'd shared a room with growing up, the one who'd helped me through my first heartbreak. But the proof was right in front of me. I hired a private investigator, and together we uncovered even more. Clara had been living a double life: luxury vacations, expensive cars, and a new house she'd bought with the money she'd stolen. Meanwhile, I'd been struggling to pay my bills, thinking the inheritance was tied up in legal delays. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. I decided to confront her. I showed up at her house unannounced, the folder of evidence in my hand. She opened the door, her face pale when she saw me. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the anger boiling inside me. She tried to play innocent at first, but when I laid out the documents, her mask slipped. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising. "Mom and Dad always favored you. This was my chance to finally have something for myself." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Our parents had loved us equally, and Clara had twisted their memory to justify her greed. I gave her one last chance to make things right. "Return what you stole and we can move on," I said. But she refused. Instead, she turned the tables, accusing me of being jealous and trying to ruin her life. She even threatened to sue me for defamation if I took the matter further. That's when I knew there was no going back. I hired a lawyer and filed a lawsuit to reclaim what was rightfully mine. The legal battle was long and exhausting, but in the end, the truth came out. The judge ruled in my favor, and Clara was forced to return the money and properties she'd taken. The fallout was messy. Some family members sided with Clara, saying I should have let it go for the sake of family harmony. Others supported me, but the damage was done. Clara and I haven't spoken since the trial, and I've made peace with that. I used part of the inheritance to start a scholarship in my parents' name, something that would honor their memory and help others. As for Clara, I heard she lost the new house and had to downsize. Sometimes I wonder if she regrets what she did, but I'll never know. What I do know is that I stood up for myself, and in the end, that was all that mattered. After the court ruling, I thought the worst was over. Clara had been forced to return the money and properties, and I finally had what was rightfully mine. But Clara wasn't done. A few weeks after the trial, I started receiving strange messages from unknown numbers. At first, they were vague. Things like, "You'll regret what you did," and Family comes first. I ignored them, thinking it was just Clara trying to intimidate me. But then, things escalated. One night I came home to find my front door slightly open. My heart raced as I stepped inside, fearing the worst. Nothing seemed out of place at first, but then I noticed a folder on my kitchen table. It wasn't there when I left. Inside were copies of old family photos, some of them torn with my face scratched out. There was also a note: "You took everything from me. Now I'll take everything from you." My hands trembled as I called the police, but they couldn't do much without evidence. Clara had always been clever and she knew how to cover her tracks. The next day I got a call from my boss. "We need to talk," he said, his tone serious. My stomach churned as I walked into his office. He handed me a printed email. It was from an anonymous account accusing me of stealing company funds and leaking confidential information. The email included fake documents with my name on them. "I don't believe this," my boss said, "but we have to investigate." I knew immediately who was behind it. Clara was trying to destroy my career, just like she'd tried to destroy my life. I fought back. I gathered all the evidence I had against Clara, the forged documents, the hidden accounts, the threatening messages, and took it to a lawyer. We filed a restraining order and a defamation lawsuit against her. It was exhausting, but I refused to let her win. Meanwhile, I had to prove my innocence at work. I showed my boss the court documents from the inheritance case and explained what Clara was capable of. He believed me, but the damage was done. My reputation had taken a hit, and I could feel the whispers and sideways glances from my co-workers. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I got a call from our aunt, the one person in the family who had always been neutral. "Clara's in the hospital," she said. My first instinct was to hang up, but something in her voice made me pause. "She tried to overdose," our aunt continued. "She's been struggling since the trial." I didn't know how to feel. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for her, but another part remembered all the pain she'd caused me. I decided to visit her, not because I forgave her, but because I needed closure. The hospital room was quiet, the only sound the steady beep of the heart monitor. Clara looked smaller than I remembered, her face pale and drawn. She opened her eyes when I walked in, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. "Why did you do it?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked away, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I deserved it," she said. "I thought if I had enough money I could finally be happy. But it didn't work. Nothing worked." I didn't know what to say. The sister I'd grown up with was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. I left the hospital that day with a heavy heart. Clara survived, but our relationship didn't. She moved to another city shortly after, and we haven't spoken since. As for me, I've tried to move on. I used part of the inheritance to start fresh, buying a small house in a quiet neighborhood. I also started volunteering at a local shelter, helping others who've been betrayed by the people they trusted. It's been a long road, but I've learned that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones that teach us the most about ourselves. Months passed, and life slowly returned to a new kind of normal. The restraining order kept Clara away, and the defamation lawsuit was settled out of court. She didn't admit guilt, but she stopped her attacks. I focused on rebuilding my life, one day at a time. The inheritance money gave me a sense of security I hadn't felt in years, but it also came with a heavy weight. Every time I looked at the family photos I kept, I was reminded of what I'd lost. Not just the money, but the trust and bond I'd once shared with Clara. One afternoon, as I was sorting through old boxes in my new house, I found a letter tucked inside a book. It was from my mother, written in her familiar handwriting. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it. The letter was dated just a few weeks before she passed away. In it, she wrote about how proud she was of me and how she hoped Clara and I would always take care of each other. "Family is everything," she wrote. "No matter what happens, remember that love is stronger than any disagreement." I sat there, tears streaming down my face, wondering what she would think of us now. The letter stirred something in me. I didn't want to reach out to Clara, I wasn't ready for that. But I realized I needed to find a way to let go of the anger and pain. I started seeing a therapist, someone who could help me work through the betrayal and the guilt I felt for not seeing Clara's actions sooner. It wasn't easy, but slowly I began to heal. I even started writing a journal, putting my thoughts and feelings into words. It helped me make sense of everything that had happened. Then, one day, I got a call from our aunt again. "Clara wants to see you," she said. My first instinct was to say no, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the letter from my mother, or maybe it was the progress I'd made in therapy. I agreed to meet Clara, but on my terms. We chose a neutral place, a small cafe in a town halfway between our homes. I was nervous as I walked in, my heart pounding in my chest. Clara was already there, sitting at a corner table. She looked different, thinner, older, and more tired than I remembered. We sat in silence for a while, neither of us knowing where to start. Finally, Clara spoke. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I know it doesn't change anything, but I needed to say it." I didn't respond right away. Part of me wanted to yell, to ask her how she could have done what she did. But another part of me remembered the letter from my mother and the years we'd spent as sisters. "Why did you do it?" I asked, my voice steady but soft. Clara looked down at her hands. "I was jealous," she admitted. "You always had everything. Mom and Dad's approval, a successful career, a life that seemed so perfect. I thought if I had the money, I could finally be happy. But it just made everything worse." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I realized then that Clara's actions weren't just about greed, they were about pain. She'd been hurting for a long time, and instead of asking for help, she'd lashed out. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it helped me understand. We talked for hours that day, about our childhood, our parents, and the choices we'd made. It wasn't a perfect conversation, and it didn't fix everything, but it was a start. After that meeting, Clara and I didn't become close again. Some wounds run too deep to fully heal. But we did find a way to coexist, to acknowledge the past without letting it define our future. I continued my work at the shelter, and Clara started therapy to address her own issues. We both learned that forgiveness isn't about forgetting, it's about finding peace. As I sit here now, writing this, I think about how far I've come. The inheritance battle taught me a lot about trust, resilience, and the importance of standing up for myself. But it also taught me that even in the darkest moments, there's always a chance for light. My parents' legacy wasn't just the money or the properties, it was the love they tried to instill in us. And while Clara and I may never have the relationship we once did, I know they'd be proud of how far we've both come. Life after the inheritance battle was quieter, but it wasn't without its challenges. I threw myself into my work at the shelter, finding solace in helping others who had been betrayed or taken advantage of. It was there that I met Sarah, a young woman who had lost everything after her husband drained their joint accounts and left her with nothing but debt. Her story resonated with me in a way I hadn't expected. We became friends, and I found myself opening up to her about what had happened with Clara. For the first time, I didn't feel ashamed or guilty, I felt understood. One evening, as Sarah and I were sorting donations at the shelter, she turned to me and said, "You know, you should write a book about what you went through. Your story could help so many people." I laughed it off at first, but the idea stuck with me. Writing had always been a way for me to process my thoughts, and the journal I'd started after the trial was filled with raw, unfiltered emotions. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe my story could make a difference. I started working on the book, pouring my heart into every chapter. It wasn't easy. Reliving the betrayal, the legal battles, and the emotional toll was painful, but it was also cathartic. I wrote about the good times with Clara, the moments of sisterhood that I still cherished, and the devastating moment I realized she had stolen from me. I also wrote about the lessons I'd learned, the importance of standing up for yourself, the power of forgiveness, and the strength it takes to rebuild after being broken. As the book took shape, I decided to reach out to Clara one last time. I didn't want to blindside her, so I sent her a letter explaining what I was doing and offering her the chance to share her side of the story. I didn't expect a response, but a week later, I got a call. Clara's voice was hesitant, but she agreed to meet. We met at the same cafe where we'd had our first real conversation after the trial. This time, the tension between us was softer, though the scars were still there. "I read your letter," Clara said, stirring her coffee nervously. "I don't know if I can face everything again, but I think it's important that people know the truth. Not just about what I did, but about why I did it." We spent hours talking, and for the first time, Clara opened up about her struggles with self-worth and the pressure she'd felt to measure up to me. It wasn't an excuse for her actions, but it was an explanation. By the end of the conversation, we agreed that she would write a chapter for the book, sharing her perspective in her own words. The book was published a year later, titled Shattered Trust: A Sister's Betrayal and the Road to Healing. It was raw, honest, and deeply personal. To my surprise, it resonated with readers in a way I hadn't anticipated. I started receiving messages from people who had gone through similar experiences: siblings, parents, friends who had been betrayed by someone they loved. They thanked me for sharing my story and for showing them that it was possible to rebuild after being broken. Clara's chapter was one of the most talked about parts of the book. She didn't sugarcoat her actions or try to justify them, but she did take responsibility. "I hurt the person who trusted me the most," she wrote. "And in doing so, I lost a part of myself that I'll never get back." Her honesty was brave, and it sparked conversations about forgiveness, accountability, and the complexities of family relationships. The success of the book opened new doors for me. I was invited to speak at events, sharing my story and offering advice to others who had experienced betrayal. It was terrifying at first, standing in front of a crowd and talking about something so personal, but it was also empowering. I realized that by sharing my pain, I was helping others feel less alone. As for Clara, we didn't become close again, but we found a way to coexist. We exchanged occasional emails, checking in on each other's lives, and even met for coffee once or twice a year. It wasn't the sisterhood we'd once had, but it was something. And sometimes, something is enough. Looking back, I realized that the inheritance battle wasn't just about money. It was about finding my voice, reclaiming my power, and learning to trust myself again. It was about understanding that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who stand by you, even when the world feels like it's falling apart. And most of all, it was about realizing that even in the darkest moments, there is always a chance for light. The success of the book brought more than just recognition. It brought a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I started receiving invitations to speak at conferences, workshops, and even on podcasts. At first, I was nervous. Standing in front of a crowd and sharing my story felt like exposing my deepest wounds to strangers. But the more I spoke, the more I realized how many people had been through similar experiences. After every event, someone would approach me with tears in their eyes saying, "Your story is my story." It was humbling and heartbreaking, but it also gave me a sense of connection I hadn't felt since before the inheritance battle. One day after a speaking event, a woman named Emily approached me. She was in her early 30s with a nervous energy that reminded me of myself during the early days of the legal battle. "I'm going through something similar," she said, her voice trembling. "My brother took control of our parents' estate after they passed, and now he's refusing to give me my share. I don't know what to do." I listened as she poured out her story, and for the first time, I felt a strong urge to do more than just share my experiences. I wanted to help people like Emily navigate their own battles. With the help of a lawyer friend I'd met during my own legal struggles, I started a nonprofit organization called Rebuild Trust. The goal was to provide resources, support, and legal guidance to people who had been betrayed by family members or loved ones. We offered free workshops on financial literacy, legal rights, and emotional healing. Emily became one of our first volunteers, and together, we built a community of survivors who were determined to reclaim their lives. Running the nonprofit was challenging, but it was also incredibly rewarding. I met people from all walks of life, men and women who had been cheated out of inheritances, business partners who had been betrayed by friends, and even parents who had been manipulated by their own children. Each story was different, but the pain was the same, and so was the resilience. Seeing people find the strength to fight back and rebuild their lives inspired me every day. Meanwhile, Clara's life took an unexpected turn. She had been quietly working on herself, attending therapy, and volunteering at a local community center. One day, she sent me an email with the subject line, "Thank you." I hesitated before opening it, unsure of what to expect. Inside, she wrote about how reading the book and seeing the impact it had on others had forced her to confront her own actions in a way she hadn't before. "I can't change the past," she wrote, "but I can try to be better. And I want you to know that I'm proud of you, not just for what you've accomplished, but for who you've become." Her words brought tears to my eyes. It wasn't an apology, but it was an acknowledgement, a small step toward healing the rift between us. I wrote back, thanking her for her honesty and wishing her well. It wasn't the reconciliation I'd once hoped for, but it was a start. As the years went by, my life became fuller in ways I hadn't expected. I met someone, a kind, understanding man named David, who had his own story of loss and resilience. We bonded over our shared experiences and our belief in second chances. He became my biggest supporter, cheering me on at every speaking event and helping me run the nonprofit. Together, we built a life filled with love, purpose, and the kind of trust I hadn't thought possible after what I'd been through. One evening, as we sat on the porch of the house we'd bought together, David turned to me and said, "You've come so far, I'm proud of you." I smiled, thinking about everything that had brought me to this moment: the pain, the betrayal, the battles, and the healing. "I'm proud of us," I replied, taking his hand. Looking back, I realized that the inheritance battle had been a turning point in my life. It had shattered me, but it had also given me the chance to rebuild myself into someone stronger, braver, and more compassionate. And while I would never wish that kind of pain on anyone, I was grateful for the lessons it had taught me. Family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who stand by you, who believe in you, and who help you become the best version of yourself. And sometimes, the hardest battles lead to the most beautiful beginnings. Years passed, and life continued to unfold in ways I could never have predicted. Rebuild Trust grew into a thriving organization, helping thousands of people navigate their own battles with betrayal and loss. Emily, the woman who had approached me after that first speaking event, became the nonprofit's program director. Together, we expanded our reach, offering online resources, support groups, and even a hotline for those in crisis. It was exhausting work, but it was also deeply fulfilling. Every thank you note, every success story reminded me why I had started it all. Clara and I never fully repaired our relationship, but we found a way to coexist peacefully. She continued her therapy and even started volunteering at a local shelter, much like I had done years earlier. We exchanged occasional emails, updating each other on our lives, and sometimes met for coffee when she was in town. Those meetings were never easy. There was always an undercurrent of tension, but they were important. They reminded me that healing isn't about erasing the past. It's about finding a way to move forward, despite it. David and I built a life together filled with love, laughter, and the kind of trust I hadn't thought possible after everything I'd been through. We got married in a small ceremony surrounded by friends and the people who had supported us along the way. Sarah, my friend from the shelter, was my maid of honor, and Emily gave a heartfelt toast about second chances and the power of community. Even Clara sent a card, wishing us happiness. It wasn't much, but it was enough. One day, as I was sorting through old boxes in our attic, I came across the letter my mother had written to me all those years ago. Her words still brought tears to my eyes. "Family is everything. No matter what happens, remember that love is stronger than any disagreement." I held the letter in my hands, thinking about how far I'd come since the day I'd first read it. My parents' legacy wasn't just the inheritance or the properties. It was the love they had tried to instill in us, even if it had gotten lost along the way. I decided to write a second book, this time focusing on the lessons I'd learned after the inheritance battle. I called it Stronger Than Broken, and in it, I wrote about the importance of resilience, the power of forgiveness, and the beauty of rebuilding a life after it's been shattered. Clara agreed to contribute a chapter again, this time writing about her journey toward accountability and self-forgiveness. Her words were raw and honest, and they added a depth to the book that I couldn't have achieved on my own. The book was released on the anniversary of my parents' passing, a date that had once been filled with pain, but now felt like a reminder of their enduring love. At the launch event, I stood in front of a crowd of readers, supporters, and survivors, feeling a sense of gratitude I couldn't put into words. Life doesn't always go the way we plan, I said, my voice steady. But sometimes the detours lead us to places we never could have imagined. And sometimes the people we become along the way are stronger, braver, and more compassionate than we ever thought possible. As I looked out at the audience, I saw Emily smiling, Sarah wiping away tears, and David giving me a thumbs up from the back of the room. And for a brief moment, I thought I saw Clara standing near the door, her face unreadable, but her presence a quiet acknowledgement of how far we'd both come. Whether she stayed or left, it didn't matter. What mattered was that I had found my way back to myself, and in doing so, I had helped others find their way too. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about my parents and the love they had tried to instill in us. I hoped they would be proud of the life I had built, not just the success or the books or the nonprofit, but the kindness, the resilience, and the willingness to forgive. Family isn't just about blood, it's about the people who stand by you, who believe in you, and who help you become the best version of yourself. And sometimes, the hardest battles lead to the most beautiful beginnings. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The past was behind me, the future was wide open, and for the first time in a long time, I was exactly where I was meant to be.